According to polls conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2012, Asian Americans are the, quote, highest income, best educated, and fastest growing racial group in the United States. They are more satisfied than the general public with their lives, finances, and the direction of the country. A little under 2 centuries ago, Asian Americans first came to the United States as low-wage laborers with hopes of finding a better life in the States. They were also the target of many racist and xenophobic lynchings, massacres, and legislations. Today, they populate some of our nation's top universities as well as corporations. So how is it that Asian Americans, specifically East Asian Americans, went from working on the railroads for pennies to one of the richest demographics in the country? Was it solely through hard work and determination? What type of hardships did they encounter throughout the years? The early history of Asian American immigration can be broken down into 3 groups: the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Filipinos. Let's start our story at the very beginning. The earliest Asian immigrants to come to America were the Chinese, who went to the United States in hopes of gaining wealth from the California gold rush. The goal for many of these immigrants was to gather some gold from California and return to China adorned with goods. Between 1849 and 1853, around 24,000 Chinese men migrated to the California area. Not all came to California in search of gold, many came to search for work. Some of the immigrants went off to work on railroads and mines, while others went to the Delta to become sharecroppers alongside the newly freed African Americans. At first, they were welcomed warmly by the native-born white Americans. They needed cheap and dispensable labor in order to rebuild after the Civil War, and the Chinese were there to fulfill such a need. The Chinese worked in fields, on rails, in mines, and in factories when the Industrial Revolution emerged in the United States. They were a large contributor to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, but of course, whenever the press wanted to take a picture of the railroad workers, the Chinese, along with many black workers, were kicked out. Many of them left the plantations by the 1870s to open up grocery stores in the Delta to serve their own community along with other demographics who weren't allowed in whites-only grocery stores. When the numbers were small, the Chinese were widely accepted. In the East Coast, especially New York City, marriages between Chinese men and Irish women were not uncommon. Such an occurrence was so frequent that it was caricatured on stage. As the population of Chinese immigrants steadily grew, as did anti-Chinese sentiments, soon they faced national backlash, especially in California. During the 1870s, white workers found it hard to compete with Chinese capitalists and Chinese laborers due to the fact that the price of their production was so low while their output remains efficient. That just escalated the already existing animosity between whites and the Chinese. Physical assault, lynchings, and massacres of the Chinese in the Old West became commonplace. They found themselves the laughingstock of racist news media as well as the victims of racist state legislation. They were forced to pay more taxes and license fees while at the same time they didn't have the right to vote. They couldn't testify against another white person, nor can they work for a public corporation. Their children were also denied the state-funded education. Washington, D.C. found the Chinese to be convenient scapegoats for all of the country's ills. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. This shut down the immigration of Chinese laborers for the next 60 years. Other legislation would even lock the Chinese out of the country even if they had property or families within the United States. So the Chinese being shut out of this country, much of the American owning class is noticing a void left by the immigrants. They needed a form of cheap and dispensable labor. That is where the Japanese, along with the Filipinos, come into the picture. The very first Japanese-American immigrants came to Hawaii in the late 1860s. Around 141 Japanese contract laborers were dispatched to Hawaii, with many of them working in sugarcane and pineapple fields. Around 1869, they soon began arriving in California. Following the heels of the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was an increase in demand for Japanese laborers in the West Coast. From 1885 to 1895, more and more Japanese began migrating to the Hawaiian Islands, as well as communities within California, Washington, and Oregon. From the end of the 19th to the early 20th century, around 300,000 of Japanese immigrants came to the US. They fulfilled the void left by the Chinese workers post-Exclusion Act, with many of them working agriculture, fishing, lumber, and of course, railroads. Many Japanese immigrants became relatively successful within these industries, especially within agriculture. They too will open up small shops to serve their own communities, as well as other demographics who weren't allowed in whites-only stores. But it was anything but smooth sailing for these immigrants. It wasn't long before they too start facing discriminatory adversity. Around 1907, President Roosevelt negotiated a gentleman's agreement with the Japanese government so Japan can stop issuing valid passports for the United States. Some other systemic barriers included not being able to become US citizens, so therefore they cannot vote. By 1913, The Alien Land Law prevented any first-generation Japanese immigrants from owning land, which thereby halted agricultural production for the community, and by the 1920s, a new legislation prevented any descendants of first-generation Japanese immigrants from owning property. It only gets worse from here. The earliest form of Filipino immigration can be found in the 1830s. This was during the time where the Philippines were still a Spanish colony, and thus many immigrants came to the United States via Spanish trade ships. They settled in New Orleans as hunters and trappers, working the second busiest US port at that time. Then American imperialism happened, and by 1898, the United States took control of the Philippines instead. The United States wasn't any less cruel to the Filipinos than the Spanish were. In 1904, about 1,000 Filipinos were brought to the St. Louis Fair as human zoo exhibitions. The living anthropological exhibits of the Filipinos was the largest exhibit at the fair. It was also a demonstration that the United States has rose to become an imperial power. The white anthropologists justified the dehumanizing treatment by dubbing white Americans as quote-unquote more human compared to the Filipino tribal folks. While some Filipinos at the time did serve in the US militaries, others weren't as fortunate. In 1917, legislation passed that restricted the immigration of other Asian immigrants except for the Filipinos. That sparked the second wave where Filipino laborers came into the continental United States looking for work and in search for a better life. The experiences of Filipino Americans are distinct due to the fact that unlike China and Japan, the Philippines was a US colony. That means, culturally speaking, the Philippines was littered with Western influences before some of these immigrants came to America, with a lot of them residing in Hawaii and California. At first, they were welcome because the United States loved the cheap and dispensable labor these immigrants brought to them. And just like the Chinese and the Japanese, the bigger their population size grew, the angrier the white Americans got. Soon they too ran into anti-Filipino sentiments, and it wasn't long before racial violence against the Filipinos became commonplace. By the time the Great Depression hit, financial adversity along with the already existing racial violence only escalated. While the Filipino community continued to keep their heads down and survive, events of the early 20th century will only continue to halt their growth. So how does it end for this era of Asian immigrants? Well, the Filipinos experienced some steady growth within their communities until the Philippine Independence Act of 1934, which restricted Philippine immigration to 50 persons per year. As for the Japanese, President Coolidge introduced the Immigration Act of 1924, which disproportionately restricted immigration from Japan. And for the Chinese, while some stayed in the US despite constant harassment from both the law and their neighbors, thousands of them sailed back to China, never to return again. That is all for today. Thank you for tuning into DisOriented. My name is Ellen Peel, and I'll see you next month where we examine World War II and the horrors of Japanese internment camps, along with other related events within that same era. But until then, good night.